Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies. Have you ever wondered all about the terminology surrounding terrain? A lot of beginning players of wargames get kind of concerned and bogged down with the different terms, such as linear terrain, raised terrain, and the distinction between things like buildings and area terrain. In this video, I'm going to unpack these concepts. I'm also going to give you some tips on how to use these pieces of terrain in your games and give you some alternate interpretations of the rules that will enhance your gameplay experience. Let's get to it. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is proudly supported by these sponsors. Terrain is about as essential to wargaming as it gets. No terrain means no tabletop, which means that you have nowhere to put your beautiful troops, orcs, wizards, robots, or whatever else you have in your miniature collection. What I want to do here is discuss the particular qualities and types of terrain you'll find on the table and how you might want to use them using Battlefront's new range. Why do I want to do this? Well, there are really two answers to this. First, and most importantly, I want to help make miniature wargaming accessible to everyone. Veteran gamers tend to take the effects of terrain on the table for granted, and broad classifications like area or linear terrain become second nature to them. Here I want to dispel the mystical nature of these terms and concepts by explaining for all to grasp. Second is to help experienced players get the most out of their terrain collections and broaden their wargaming horizons. I'm primarily approaching this as a Team Yankee player because that's the terrain we're featuring. Despite this, the general points I'm making, and even the models I show, are not specific to just this system. You can take what I cover here to apply to any system or scale that you see fit. Next, you won't hear me give a blow-by-blow discussion of specific rules. What provides a -1 to hit or causes a cross-check is not so much of my concern. The broader terms that go beyond the specific rules are our interest here. So, with all this out of the way, let's get down to it. The golden rule of miniature wargaming that's at the heart of the hobby is to always discuss the table layout and terrain effects before you even pick up your dice. Do this before any in-game details are finalized. Don't deploy, and make sure that in games like Team Yankee or Flames of War, you don't place artillery tokens or other things like minefields either. Just stop and go over the effects of every terrain piece on the table in a context that both you and your opponent can understand. Leave no stone unturned, and work out if that building is going to provide a -1 to hit, be bulletproof, or any other effect. Well-rounded discussion eliminates surprises, so it's important. Frequently, if it's your terrain collection you're using, your opponent will follow your rules. But in competitive environments, be prepared to negotiate game effects for the terrain. Finally, while we're on this point, remember that conflicts in the rules will happen, even if you go over the details of the terrain in excruciating detail. I imagine that at least once per game, you and your opponent will have differing interpretations of what a particular hill, building, or wall can do. This is a natural consequence of miniature gaming. The way to solve this is for both players to state their case and find the one that suits the intent of the rules best. If that doesn't work, or if you don't want to take the time to sidetrack the game over such minutiae, just roll a die to determine which interpretation stands. After the game, you can go back, refer to the rulebook, and negotiate a long-term solution. With these points covered, now it's time to turn to take a look at the terrain itself. Do you like free paint? Of course you would. You're a miniature painter. And now could be your lucky day because Miniature Landscape Hobbies is holding a contest. You can win a free Army Painter Most Wanted speed paint set. In order to enter, all you need to do is comment on a post on Miniature Landscape Hobbies pages for Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. Share your favorite hobby tip and then enter hashtag MLH to participate. Terrain. No matter what your respective rulebook calls it, it can broadly be classified as 5 different classes: impassable, raised or elevated, linear, area, and roads. With these, you might find a variety of different types. Woods might be area terrain, while buildings could be both area and raised terrain. 99% of the time, it should be clear what you're looking at. But remember, these terms are very general and system agnostic. If you want to see the actual game effect of a piece of terrain, you may need to translate the general class into the terminology used by your preferred rules. Fortunately, since we're looking at Team Yankee here, you can just head over to page 33 of the rulebook and get the details. Let's take a look at our classes of terrain, one by one. Impassable terrain is terrain that you just can't go through. If it's tall, it might also block line of sight. Sounds simple, but it really isn't. Think about it. Under what circumstances is a real-world object or geographic feature really impassable? You can go in buildings, swim in rivers, and climb mountains. In some cases, you can even fly over them. Because of this, actual impassable scenery becomes rare. What constitutes impassability, if that's actually a word, will also change by the model that interacts with it. A building is likely impassable to a tank, but not to infantry, for instance. Now, any terrain and what it does should be fairly apparent after you have the pre-game discussion with your opponent. And assuming you have defined what models find the terrain as impassable, then the rest is easy. But you also will need to consider the terrain's height for sake of lines of sight where models need to spot each other or shoot weapons. A minefield or bog could be impassable, but this wouldn't stop me from shooting past or over it. If it was an impassable mountain, however, that would be different, unless maybe my model was a helicopter or a plane. Because of this, resolving these details is a must before you play. Impassable terrain does have one really good use, though: to simplify rules. Imagine you're teaching a new gamer or just want to play a fast-paced game. Designated large amounts of terrain as impassable effectively eliminates the complications of concealment and cover, which allows for a more streamlined use of the rules, and therefore simplified, faster play. For experienced gamers, however, you probably want to minimize the amounts of impassable objects on the table, as this would greatly limit the tactical options and immersive qualities of the game itself. Raised or elevated terrain is anything that allows your models to stand higher than the surface of the game table. Hills are the classic example, but buildings apply here as well, where you can stand on the roof or go to upper levels. In a practical sense, raised terrain blocks line of sight, as it's unlikely you can see clearly through a building or a hill. But you must still ask which models can take advantage of the raised scenery and what the effects of the terrain's height are. If the raised area is a building, it's likely apparent that a tank or other vehicle can't climb onto the top to improve its view, but infantry certainly can. For hills, this is probably less clear-cut. Steeper rocky hills might be impassable to vehicles, but not infantry, or maybe they require specific movement penalties. For Team Yankee, this is easy. Just take cross-checks, but for other systems, you might need to reduce travel distances or some other effect. Height is the complex part of raised terrain. How high above the table is high enough to see over intervening buildings, geography, or walls? There are traditionally 2 ways to handle this in wargaming. First is to assume raised terrain is infinitely tall, so a hill can't see over another hill or a building, but they can see over terrain of the non-raised variety. Second, you can use the what you see is what you get approach. If you take a model's eye view from the raised terrain, you can see literally what the model can see, and you can use this as its line of sight. Which of these styles is best? Well, that's really up to you. But if you want my own opinion, I feel that the what you see is what you get approach is superior. The infinite height approach is just too abstract and ignores the interesting character of what you have in your terrain collection. Linear terrain is terrain that forms a line. It's typically a wall or hedge, but could be piles of equipment, and for the more Games Workshop inclined, piles of skulls, I suppose. Linear scenery really has three characteristics to watch out for: height, construction, and how it provides cover. The effects of height should be apparent. If the wall, hedge, etc. is taller than the trooper or vehicle behind it, there's just no line of sight. Where this gets more complex is when you consider how much of the model needs to be exposed to have in-game effects like changing to hit values. This, of course, is dependent on your rules and what you have discussed with your opponent. Over the years, I've pretty well observed miniature gamers of all sorts have agreed that if more than 50% of the model is visible, then it likely is not in cover. Construction is what the linear obstacle is made of. In many systems, this modifies saving throws, requires firepower checks, or has some other similar mechanic. You simply need to agree ahead of time on what this effect is. In Team Yankee, it boils down to whether or not terrain is bulletproof and therefore requires firepower checks. The mechanic of how a linear piece of terrain actually works always relates to how the models use it to claim cover as a bonus from their opponent. This is almost always a function of how close the defending model is to the linear terrain. For Team Yankee, a team must be within 2 inches of the terrain. Otherwise, the intervening linear feature will hinder both the attacker and the defender. I find that in the grand scheme of wargaming, linear features are rarely contentious and are straightforward for wargamers to grasp. What isn't straightforward is what comes next: area terrain. Area terrain is terrain your models can go into. The classic examples are woods and buildings. Of course, like other terrain, you need to remember that some models can go into it, while others probably can't. The rules surrounding woods are generally more straightforward than buildings, and they'll largely include the same considerations as linear terrain. There'll almost always be bonuses for cover, and you'll have to figure out how far into the terrain a model has to be to claim that cover, or even be visible. As an example, in Team Yankee or Flames of War, a model has to be within 6 inches of the edge of area terrain to see out of it, and to be seen in return. Anything drawing a line of sight through more than 6 inches of terrain is not visible. Another consideration is since most area terrain is rough going, there'll often be need to modify movement distances. As always, and I think you'll probably have noticed the theme by now, if you discuss this with your opponent first, there should be no hassles here. Buildings. Well, these are the tricky ones. Buildings with their windows, doors, multiple levels, and construction materials are always an issue for wargaming rules. They generally take up many pages of rules in the rulebook, and are the first subject of alternate rule sets or erratas to come out as game editions age. Unfortunately, this is just something we have to live with in the hobby. Nevertheless, we really can't get by without buildings because they offer strategic and visual variety in our games. Because of this, you'll commonly see 2 approaches to buildings in most terrain rules. First is the what you see, what you get version, and the second is what I like to call the footprint method. What you see is what you get just implies that the model's eye view is used to determine what can and can't be seen from inside a building. If they're at a window, they can see out and can also shoot out. If they want to get into the building, they can go through a window, door, or hole in the wall. Beyond this, moving and claiming cover bonuses inside the building is typically the same as for woods, though the modifiers will be more extreme based on the construction of the building. The footprint method generally assumes that once a model is in the building, it occupies the whole thing, basically making the building one miniature, sometimes with multiple units in it. Variations exist on this, where it's subdivided into rooms or levels, but not always. The advantage of this approach is simplicity, as it's hard to tell where lines of sight are inside large structures. And usually, a window or other aperture is not required to get into or out or even shoot from a building as a result, because the whole building represents the miniatures inside it. Both of these methods are commonly used in wargames, and in fact, Team Yankee can be used with either type of rule set. I don't really favor one approach over the other most of the time. In my opinion, for 28mm style wargaming, where you have one model per base, the what you see, what you get method seems to work just fine. In 15mm wargames, or other systems where multiple models occupy the same base, the footprint method seems more reasonable. Due to these complexities, I would say typically 3/4 of the pre-game conversations I have with my opponent involve clarifying building rules. It's just something you should be prepared to do. Since we're talking primarily Team Yankee here, I would encourage you to try the Flames of War city fighting rules that are available on the Battlefront website. The rules, of course, are fully compatible with Team Yankee and really do make the game that much more dynamic in urban areas. While you're there, you might want to read many of the numerous supplemental articles on the rule set too. Why? Well, because I wrote most of them. Now we come to the last terrain class, roads. This is also the simplest type to use. Whether your roads are highways, footpaths, or something in between, they serve two functions on the table that are probably universal across all miniature gaming rule sets. First and most obviously, roads facilitate travel for your models. In game terms, this usually takes the form of removing movement penalties from difficult terrain, grants bonus movement, or some combination of the two. In Team Yankee and Flames of War, you get to take advantage of road dash speeds by moving much faster on roads or paths while trading this for an opportunity to shoot. This is a typical balancing mechanic I've encountered in most miniature games. Roads let you move further, but take away certain other actions to create balance. The second thing is roads, paths, trails, etc., defined generally where major terrain components are clustered. Think about it. Buildings, airfields, and military facilities will pretty much always be near transportation corridors. This makes roads essential for your tabletop, as they'll usually be the defining feature to build your battlefield around. Often, when experienced miniature gamers set up a table for a game, the roads, out of necessity, will be placed first, and the rest will be filled in later. Keep in mind that you could always do it the other way around, and you wouldn't lose any of the secret street cred that all miniature gamers crave, because 1. The setup will still work, just be a little harder to do, and 2. Miniature gamers don't have any street cred anyway. So there you have it, my guide to understanding terrain. We've covered a lot, but there's still plenty more to talk about. If you have any tips surrounding terrain or any other aspect of miniature gaming, remember to put these in the video comments and add #MLH to enter my draw for the Army Painter Most Wanted Speed Paint set that's coming up in November. Lastly, remember that if you take 1 point away from this video, it's to stress the importance of open communication with your opponent about the terrain features in your game before you start to play. This will eliminate conflict, lead to visually pleasing games tables, and most importantly, ensure everyone involved has fun. If you'd like to learn more about creating immersive wargaming tables, please watch this video. If you want to see my method for enhancing pre-painted terrain, then watch this video instead. Thanks for watching, and as always, remember to keep building life in miniature.